Hello and welcome back. So today we're going to come back to this issue of the Marxist critique of the subjective theory of value and the Austrian theory of market prices, because I already commented on this about 3 months ago, and I feel that there are more things that can be said, and I also want to tackle this issue by looking exactly at the arguments put forth by the people who actively defend this issue. So today we're going to do so by criticizing the lecture made on the subjective theory of value by an economist who considers himself a defender of the Austrian School of Economics. His name is David Howden, and he works in St. Louis University here in Madrid. So what we're going to do is basically comment on what was said in this lecture and make a critique from the Marxist perspective of the Austrian theory of value. And once again, we're going to make this criticism by looking at the deficiencies of the Austrian theory and by acknowledging the fact that the classical theory of value actually presented us with a more scientific conceptualization of the issue that we're going to be studying, and it also gives us a testable hypothesis that has been proven right by the data, making it therefore a theory. And allow me to comment first that I originally had in my mind the intention of playing clips of the lecture in order to make criticism specifically to certain points that were made particularly by this professor, but I found the lecture so unnecessarily full of many things that really had no context whatsoever in there, full of terrible jokes and full of things that were completely irrelevant. So I've decided that in order to save us the having to struggle through that lecture once again, what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to explain myself the things that were said in the lecture. I'm going to present the points that were presented in that lecture. So if you want to watch it yourself, you can, but I am not going to play the clips because I really don't find a necessity on it because of, the nature of that lecture that really was very disappointing. But before I begin with the arguments, I first want to make something that the Austrian economists don't like doing that much, which is contextualizing the issue that we're particularly going to discuss today and try to explain exactly what is it that we're trying to explain, why it's important to explain this, and where does this issue really originate from. So when we're speaking about theories of value, their main intention is to explain exactly why commodities exchange against one another in the proportions that they do. And this is an issue that has become prevalent in our capitalist societies precisely because capitalism is a mode of production characterized by the extension, by the generalization of commodity production, of the production of use values for exchange, not just to be consumed by the particular producer who is employed in manufacturing them. Because all throughout history, the wealth of nations was essentially constituted by use values. It was constituted by the material use values that were created in those societies, but capitalism is different because the use value takes a different form, which is that of a commodity in capitalist societies. Because, as I've said, use values are now not only produced for the personal consumption of the producer, but to be exchanged in the market. And thus, a social property of this commodity arises, which is that of being exchangeable, that of having this property of commensurability. Therefore, once commodity production has been generalized, we want to explain exactly how and why do these commodities exchange against one another in the way that they do. Well, first of all, because it is a fundamental aspect of any economic theory. If you want to build a cohesive theory of how capitalist economies work, you need to start from some foundation of value, of what explains exactly what regulates the exchange value of commodities, and also because this is something that can give us an understanding of a lot of the patterns that we see in the data, because in the data we see regularity, in the data we see patterns, and this is something that in the Marxist tradition, for example, and in the classical economic tradition, has been explained first with the labor theory of value, and then with other subsequent theories, such as the theory of persistent unemployment, the law of the rate of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and so on and so forth, which constitute our understanding or theoretical understanding of capitalist economies, which is at the same time well supported by data. So then we know that in all societies, use values have been what comprise the material wealth of those societies. And yet in capitalist societies, this changes because now use values, because commodity production is generalized, have a different property, another property to them, which is that of being commensurable. And thus, in order to explain capitalist societies, we need to first look at why exactly, where does this property arise from, and why this property works in the particular way that it does. And what we see is that this property is a social property, because we know that use values have existed all throughout history, and yet we know that in capitalist societies they adopt this particular form. So the substance of their exchange value, what explains, what regulates them, needs to be also something social, precisely because their property of commensurability is a social property. And something that gives us a hint at this particular social property of commodities is precisely the fact that when commodity production is generalized, money emerges as a means to compare commodities against one another, and so their exchange value gets reduced to this unit of money. Of, for example, 1 kilogram of deer meat costs, let's say, $10, and 1 kilogram of oranges costs $10. So they both get reduced to that, not to that another thing, which is that money, that those $10. And what this is telling us exactly is that there is an equivalence, that there's an equality of exchange value between these two commodities, and this is social because money emerges in societies, and it particularly emerges in those societies where there is this generalization of exchange. And as we've already seen in previous videos, the Austrian economists, by abstracting from all that is social, miss out a lot of these points and are unable to explain social phenomena, one of which is particularly this one. And we already noted in our last video on this issue of subjective value that this exchange between the 1 kilogram of oranges that costs $10 and 1 kilogram of deer meat that also costs $10 is problematic in the Austrian school, because aggregate utility between the producers of those two commodities has increased because both have exchanged something that they didn't find as useful for something that they now find more use in, and yet their exchange value is still $10. So what this is telling us is, as we already noted, that exchange value and use value are things of different nature, because use values essentially, well, first of all, utility, the utility that we experience from those use values is subjective, it is not comparable, and the use values themselves are heterogeneous. You know, we said that a calculator is not the same thing as a bottle of water, is not the same thing as a pencil. They are different things, and thus we need to explain why exactly they get reduced to something that they have in common, something that they represent a greater quantum or a smaller quantum. And in the classical tradition, it is well known that this reduction is made to their direct and indirect labor times. So what regulates, what explains exactly this equality in exchange is essentially inequality in direct and indirect labor times for producing these two commodities. And we already saw in our last video what happens if, for example, preferences change and there is a lesser quantity of some of those commodities demanded, and how as supply accommodates the new demand, these prices, market prices, get again converge to these natural prices, which are the ones that give them equal profit rates and which are the ones that are actually fundamentally determined by the direct and indirect labor times. So once again, this is a reduction that it's well known in the classical tradition and that is well known in Marx, and yet the Austrians are going to deny to begin with, that this reduction exists, even though it exists, because we see that if 1 kilogram of oranges is exchanged by 1 kilogram of deer meat, and both cost $10, that they have an equality and that they are both reduced to something different from themselves, which is $10. And the Austrians are going to deny this, which is already a bad move, and at the same time they're going to give us a theory of value that is going to leave the picture unexplained, precisely because it's going to abstract from the social nature of these exchanges, and it's going to focus on a subjective thing that we cannot really measure, that we cannot really know, something that only manifests when people act, and it is very unclear. It gives us it doesn't give us the possibility of establishing economic laws, and it doesn't explain the patterns that we see in the data, which are explained by the labor theory of value. So now that we have noted all of this, let us get back to the lecture by David Howden and see how exactly he's going to tackle this issue, and how the Austrian theory of value is going to try to explain this phenomena that we have described, and it's at the same time going to try to meet the requirements that we have laid. So to begin with, David Howden explains to us that prices are things that are wonderful because they contain a lot of information in a single number that a consumer can just look at in order to make the decision of whether or not they want to purchase something, instead of having to research a lot of things and having to know many things about the state of the market. The only thing that they need to do is precisely look at the number and then make their decision. And I'm not going to argue with this particular contention, in the sense that prices do contain some information that is useful and that simplifies the lives, to some extent, the lives of consumers. So this is something that it's not really a problem, but what is a problem is the way in which he's going to explain the origination of these prices and what really regulates them. And here he's going to say, quite ironically, that the Austrian theory of value gives us a more realistic and far better understanding of this process than pretty much any other theory, where he includes the neoclassical theory. And this is ironic because, as we're going to see, his particular explanation and the Austrian theory of value in general, whether he explains it or Karl Menger explains it, regardless of who explains it, is really not a very realistic and very, fact-based theory. It is, on the other hand, a very bizarre theory that I think makes some assumptions that are not justified at all. And we're going to see this, but this is something that we want to keep in mind, right? That he says that this theory actually gives us a more realistic look into exchange, which is something that I am going to be extremely critical of. So then David Howden continues by explaining to us Karl Menger's definition of what an economic good is, and he gives us these 4 criteria that Karl Menger outlined for an economic good to be so, which are precisely that of being an object outside of us that satisfies some need that we have, and that there is a causal connection with that need. Also, that this connection needs to be understood. There needs to be knowledge of this connection by the person who has this particular need, and that there needs to be someone in command of that particular economic good. Now, this definition resembles to some extent Marx's definition of a commodity, although it's not the same, because Marx defined the commodity as a use value that is outside of us, an object that is useful, that is outside of us, and that it has an exchange value. And he didn't make this specification of, someone has to have control over that particular use value before it is exchanged. I mean, it's something that can generally be the case, so it's not a particular thing, but these definitions are slightly different, although they kind of resemble each other. And after explaining this, David Howden presents to us what is the main proposition of the subjective theory of value, which is essentially the contention that value is subjective and it exists within our minds. Therefore, it cannot be compared interpersonally. And here he notes that although economic goods are in fact objective in that they exist outside of us and they have objective properties to them, such as their weight, their volume, their shape, etc. Even though this is the case, the particular utilities that we extract from those objective goods are subjective, and everyone has their own valuation of these things, even though they objectively exist outside of us and they have objective properties to them. This leads him to the conclusion that value is essentially a product of the mind, which there are certainly many more parts to our bodies than just our brain, even though our brain is a fundamental part of it. But, at a basic level, it is the case that our own valuation of things springs essentially from our mind. And since he considers value to be something subjective that exists in our mind, he also is led to the conclusion that there's no constancy of value through time, since our preferences are changing all the time and there's not really some consistency to them. So there isn't this, you cannot really establish this, you cannot really measure them, you cannot really establish consistency through time, precisely because these utilities that we derive from economic goods are subjective and they are not comparable, and they are in a constant process of being changed. And so David Howden concludes that value is expressed in the form of utility, and that economic goods will only have value insofar as they have some use to them, insofar as they are useful to someone. And from a Marxist perspective, this proposition would not be wrong so long as what you are referring to when you speak of value is use value. So if you are speaking about the fact that our own particular preferences of goods are subjective, and that the uses that we derive from these objects of social use are subjective, then it is in fact the case that if you define that to be value, this is subjective. However, what we would consider that he is doing here is conflating use value with value, because what we've already established is that exchange value is a property that is essentially social in nature, and that through it, commodities get reduced to something that they all have in common, of which they represent some greater or some lower quantum. And thus, if you want to explain this through use value, through utilities, which are not, there's no social mean of utility, you cannot reduce all commodities to a single mean of utility. Since this is the case, in the Marxist tradition, we wouldn't consider value to be subjective precisely because of this issue. Although we do consider that use value is subjective, and that for an object to be a commodity, it must have some use, it must be useful as a condition, as a necessary condition for that object to be a commodity. And therefore, what we would consider to be value is a property that all of these commodities have in common, of which they represent some greater or some smaller quantum, that is, in our tradition, abstract, socially necessary, direct and indirect labor times. So here we are already in a muddy terrain, because whereas in the Marxist and in the classical tradition, we are actually presenting something that we can test, something that we can measure, something that we can establish a certain economic law around it, in the Austrian tradition, they are not really going to present this to us. They're going to speak about subjective value, and they are going to acknowledge that it is not comparable, that it is not measurable, that it is completely subjective. So we don't really have anything that we can really measure, something that we can test. So here already we are in what we would consider a pseudo-scientific terrain. This would be like ascribing to gravity some sort of supernatural law that is, gravity is essentially angels moving around things according to their own, to whatever goes on in their minds. And this is what explains the movement of planets, and this is what explains the attraction of bodies that have a mass to them. Now, of course, if you were to present this theory, this would be, how can you even test if this is true or not? However, if you present a theory of gravity that actually tries to pin down gravity to some natural forces, to something that you can actually test, to something that you can measure, right, to the mass of those objects that are being attracted, and so on and so forth, then you have a proper scientific theory. So here we're already jumping into this terrain where one theory is actually presenting something that is testable, something that we can measure, and the other one is speaking to a more pseudoscientific part of the story. It's trying to speak to subjective preferences, and yet they are going to try to establish certain laws, even as they are acknowledging that these are completely subjective, that there's no constancy through time, and so on and so forth. So what exactly are these laws of utility that they are now going to try to establish, even as before they had said that utility is something subjective, it's something that is constantly changing and that it cannot be compared between people? Well, these laws are essentially, on the first hand, the law of non-satiation, which proposes the idea that more of something will always be better than less of that good. And this is not a law, because one could perfectly think of cases in which more of something actually makes you less happy than having less of that something, such as, for example, what we saw a couple of weeks ago with respects to the oil market, and how certain people had too much oil that they couldn't store, and therefore they had to pay other people to take it off their hands. And here in this case, the way in which he's going to shield himself from criticism, David Howden, is by saying that, well, it is the case that this law always holds true, but in the cases where it doesn't, well, that's because the economic good has stopped being a good, and therefore this law doesn't apply to it, which is essentially a tautology, in that this law starts by saying that more of a good is always preferable to less of that good, and then when it is confronted with the idea that it's not necessarily the case, that we can in fact come up with examples where it's not better, he is going to say, well, this theory only applies to those things so long as we consider them goods. Therefore, what he's basically established is that you will always prefer more of something so long as you actually prefer more of that something. This is a tautology right from the very get-go. And this is a problem, because you're trying to establish laws on utility that is subjective, and when you try to establish these laws, you're basically going to have to appeal to certain things, and you're going to try to make these cases that are, of course, going to end up like this one in tautologies, because it doesn't make too much sense to establish laws about these preferences, even as you have acknowledged that they exist within our minds and that they are constantly being changed. The second of these two laws of utility is that of diminishing marginal utility, which essentially proposes this idea that when you have more of that good, you're going to be more satisfied than before, but at a slower rate. So as you get more of whatever good that you're getting, you're going to become happier, but this is going to be slower as you get more units of that good, because with each extra unit, the need that you needed to satisfy with that good is already going to be satisfied, and therefore you're not really going to experience too much more pleasure from having more of that particular good. Now, these two laws can essentially be represented in this logarithmic function, which is why in neoclassical economics these log utility functions are so oftenly used to do in classes and to do research and so on and so forth, precisely because they embody these two particular laws of utility, that of non-satiation and that of diminishing marginal utility. And once again, this law of diminishing marginal utility is not really a law, because it's not necessarily the case that the more you have of something, the lower that the rate of increment of your utility is going to be from receiving that something. For example, if at quantity 5 of some good my marginal utility is some value, and at 9 my marginal utility actually has increased, then this law doesn't really exist. And this could perfectly happen for whatever subjective reason of my own. So it's not necessarily the case that this is a law, once again. So when we've tried to establish two laws of utility, already we came up first with a tautology, and second with a law that it's not really a law, although it can certainly apply in certain cases, or in a lot of cases we don't really know, because each one has their own preferences and each one has their own valuation of things. When we're speaking, for example, about a family going to a supermarket and picking out of the thousands of goods that are offered there, let's say 100 of them, what the economist is saying is, well, they picked those precisely because in their preference scale they lied in this particular order and so on and so forth. But this is something that they don't know. This is something that they actually don't know. It's something that you cannot test, these preference scales. You cannot really know if they even exist. There's no evidence given to their existence. And the only thing that the Austrian economists are really going to say is, well, if they chose those 100 items, that's because in their preference scales, they lied in there. And these preference scales, as we are going to see, are the ones that are going to explain market prices, but preference also change with market prices. In fact, we in a lot of instances, our valuation of certain things depends on the price that goes into those things. So in a sense, this is a circular movement. You're trying to explain prices by appealing to preferences, but preferences also change and are shaped by those prices themselves. So this is really a world that the Austrian economists are building that is completely undetermined, that is completely full of this heterogeneity. You cannot establish really any laws, and even the laws that you try to establish are not actually laws. And so we're here in a world that is extremely anti-scientific. And if we actually look at the statistics that we have in capitalist societies, we see that there are patterns, we see that there are statistical regularities. Therefore, in the world that they're presenting us of preferences that are subjective, that cannot be compared, of preferences that change throughout time, so there's no regularity in them and so on, this is something that goes against precisely what we see in the statistics, what we see in the data. And furthermore, even if we want to speak only about the preferences of one single individual, there could be a countless amount of possible ways in which we could categorize them. So putting it all into this single preference scale seems quite bizarre to me. And yet this is not going to stop the Austrian economists from trying to explain, based on this preference scale that consumers supposedly have and that sellers supposedly have when they interact in the market, this is not going to stop them from using this framework in order to determine the formation of prices. So here is the important part of all of this. How does David Howden explain to us that prices are originated? And let's remember that he said at the beginning that this was a very realistic formation of prices and so on and so forth. Well, now we're gonna see. So as you can see in the screen right now, the way in which he's going to explain the formation of this particular price in this market is essentially in the following way. So first of all, one, by looking at this table, could be misled into believing that this is the market for coffee, when in reality it isn't. Because if you look carefully, you'll see that this actually is the market for first coffee. And what exactly is a first coffee? Is it the first coffee of the day? Is it the first coffee of the month? Is it the first coffee of the year? Are the people that have already drunk a coffee that particular day willing to trade in that market? What exactly is that first coffee thing? So we don't actually have an answer to this, but David Howden is going to pretend as if this is the market for coffee, because he says that this is actually the market for coffee. So let's work based on this assumption that this particular market is that of coffee. So first of all, you might notice that in this extremely realistic market that he has presented to us here, there's only one good, which is one coffee. So the sellers are not producers of coffee. They only have one coffee each, and thus they cannot really produce any more coffees, because in this example there's only one coffee that is being traded, which is that first coffee. And this is already not realistic, because when you look at the market, each seller doesn't just have one unit of that good that they're selling you. They actually have multiple of those, and they actually produce those so that they can reproduce that particular good, and they can, well, they can sell more than one. They can in fact sell 2 or 3 or 4 or however quantity. So if you're looking at that particular market, You will not just see X amount of producers, each of which has only one quantity of that good. So this is already not realistic at all. This is also not realistic because, as you can see in the table, these all participants have a very nice and simple preference scale where there's, one quantity of money, then a coffee, and then another quantity of money in this very simple way, which is actually something that is not realistic. When you go to the market, in your mind, there are hundreds of things, a lot of which are unconscious, and you don't really have this neat preference scale right there. We don't even know if you have such a preference scale as the ones that they are trying to portray here. So these are already two things that are unrealistic. And the funniest thing about this table is not even the fact that it's not realistic in this sense, but it's also that it's actually wrong. It's poorly written, because if you look at the demand and supply schedules that he has written under the preference scales, you'll notice that for price 4, in the row for price 4, the quantity demanded is correct, but the quantity supplied is not correct, because at that price only 2 coffees will be supplied, because the seller X values $3 more than one coffee, which means that he values $4 more than one coffee. Well, the values, if we assume that his preference is smooth in this sense, which is something that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. If you prefer $3 to a coffee, it would generally mean that you would prefer $4 to a coffee. But this is if we are assuming some sort of, perfect rationality and so on and so forth. But this is not necessarily the case. However, if we assume in this example that preferences are transitive, we will actually see that, for example, seller I will also enter the market because they prefer $4 more than a coffee, but however, seller Z will not enter the market because they prefer one coffee to that $4 that you see at a lower place in the preference scale. Therefore, the quantity supplied in for $4 will actually be 2. And this is not the only mistake, because if we look at the next row, at the row for price 3, you'll see that the quantity demanded is correct once again, but the quantity supplied is actually wrong. Here, he's saying that the quantity supplied is 2, but actually the quantity supplied would be only 1 coffee, because you might notice here that $3 are above in the preference scale of seller X to the first coffee, but they are not above in the preference scale of seller Y and seller Z. In the case of seller Z, if we assume transitivity, which means that in this market there is actually not that equilibrium. So if you look at the table that I have written where the values are actually correct, you'll notice here that there is no equilibrium where supply equals demand in this market, which is pretty ironic, because he's trying to reach this equilibrium, right? This venerated equilibrium of the Austrian and the neoclassical economists, and he has presented us as example where there is not even an equilibrium. So the price in this market is undetermined. We don't know what the price is. And this is ironic precisely because what we are left with in this example is actually an undetermined price. They are trying to explain price using their framework, and actually what we are left with is that price is undetermined. And this is actually a problem that characterizes a lot of the examples that are given to us even by the Austrian economists themselves in their texts, where they give us a range for the exchange value of two commodities, but they don't really tell us exactly where it's going to lie between that range, because they say, well, this is going to be based on the negotiating power of the parties involved, and so on and so forth. So in reality, we are left undetermined. And this is the irony of the example, that it's trying to picture in a very unrealistic fashion a market where there is this fantastic equilibrium between supply and demand, and it's actually pointing to a market where there's no equilibrium, where the price is undetermined, which actually reflects the nature of his own theory, which is the theory of leaving things undetermined, of speaking to things that are, that live in our own subjective minds and that you cannot really test, and so on and so forth. So this is exactly the problem with this theory, that things are left undetermined, that you cannot really establish any laws of exchange. The only thing that you can say is, well, people are going to want to pay as less as possible for a given good, and they are going to, the ones that are trying to sell it are going to try to sell it as highest as possible, which is trivial because everyone knows and everyone has known in the entire history of economics that in the market people are going to try to give as much, they're trying to get as much as possible and give as less as they can. So since this example is not a realistic example at all, where there's actually not even an equilibrium, that fantastic equilibrium that they're trying to reach in order to say, aha, this is going to be the quantity and the price that are going to be traded at in this particular market, since this actually is not, again, a successful example, let us look at another example that is actually far more realistic in order to see exactly what are the flaws with the Austrian theory of value. So first, let's imagine that consumers don't have these preference scales, but on the other hand, they have some idea of how much they would want to pay for that coffee. And let's imagine that they all would want to pay up to $5. So they would like to pay anything between those $5 and even those $5, but they wouldn't want to pay more than $5 for coffee. And then let's imagine that we're actually in a market where each seller doesn't only have one particular good, but where they actually reproduce those coffees, that they produce more than one, and they actually compete against one another. Because this is something that he left out of the picture in his example, which is also makes it unrealistic, which is he left competition out of his example in the market for coffee. Now let's include this. So let's imagine that these three producers actually have to face the fact that they have certain costs if they want to post their prices, because competition makes it so that the ones that sell above, very, very above their cost, are actually going to tend to be outcompeted by those who sell at a margin that is very close to their costs. So let's imagine that the cost of producing that particular coffee is $2. And let's imagine that out of those three producers that sell that particular coffee, one of them sells at $4, one of them sells at $3, and one of them sells at $2.5. So what would be a realistic outcome in this scenario? Well, the realistic outcome would be that the ones that produce coffee and sell it at $4 are actually going to tend to not sell their coffee to those consumers that would like to pay up to $5 for that coffee, because there's others that are selling it at 2.5 or at 3, and the one that sells at 2.5 is going to get more consumers than the one that sells at 3. So what would tend to happen is that the one that has the leading price, the smallest price of all of them, because it's able to sell at the lowest margin from their cost, is going to tend to get that consumer base, and is going to tend to run out of business the other ones. So the price that will tend to prevail is that one. So if you look at that particular market, because the costs are 2 for producing that particular coffee, you'll see that the one that sells closest to that, in this case 2.5, is going to be the one that is going to lead. So whatever quantity of those, imagine that there's whatever quantity in that market of coffee is being sold, depending on who wants to buy it and how, is actually going to be sold at that particular price. So under a theory of price that is more realistic, that takes into consideration costs, this is actually going to be determined. The price is going to be determined, and we can actually test it. This is something that we could test. Of course, in this particular example not, because this is an imaginary example. But if we go to the market and we see, for example, the price of steel, we can in fact build a determined natural price for that steel based on the production costs, and we can see how close it lies to the actual market price of steel, and we can see if it explains movements in the actual market price of steel, and we can explain many things that the Austrians cannot, because for them this is all just subjective. This is all just about preferences and so on and so forth. So in reality, they are leaving the story undetermined, unexplained. Whereas we can actually give a testable hypothesis. We can point to a price. We can point to a determined actual equilibrium, whereas the others can't. When we look at a market, we only really know the price and the quantity of goods that are being sold. We don't know exactly what consumers would have done in the case that the price was X amount higher. We don't know all of the other points in these demand curves. Or supply curves. We don't really know them. We only know that particular point, and that is what we are trying to explain. That quantity and that particular price. And how do we explain that exchange value? How do we explain that price? Is it through appealing to some subjective preferences that we cannot test, that we cannot measure? Or can we do it by actually looking at the costs of production, by actually looking at the state of that market and realizing whether or not our hypothesis is actually empirically correct? Well, our explanation of this is actually more realistic and it's actually more scientific in the sense that it can be tested, unlike the Austrian theory of value. So the main point about all of this is that capitalist societies are characterized by competition, by conflict. They are characterized by a constant war against producers to get a bigger market share than the others, to outcompete them, and so on and so forth. And one of the main ways in which this is done is by selling at a lower price, because you have been able, through technological advances and so on and so forth, to lower your costs of production and therefore to sell per unit at a lower price. So this is the point. Capitalism gives us certain, in the chaos that the competition as a war is, we are able to see statistical patterns. We are able to see laws governing exchange, governing unemployment, governing certain aspects of it that in other theories are left unexplained, are left undetermined, like in the Austrian case of the theory of the subjective theory of value. So this is the actual point that I want to make here. It is precisely that the Austrians have this problematic that already springs from their flawed methodology, where they use individualistic methodologies, where they put consumption before production as an analytical priority, where they try to look at things from this ahistorical standpoint. What we find is that they don't build proper theories of social phenomena, that they cannot understand properly social phenomena precisely because they're constantly, as we've already mentioned in other videos, running away from that social phenomena. They don't acknowledge the social nature of exchange value, which is characterized in this sense that these commodities are reduced to a given social mean that is expressed by value, by socially abstract, socially necessary labor time, and they are unable, therefore, to give us a proper scientific understanding of value and then of many other things that go along with it. And this is pretty much how I want to end the video. So if you have enjoyed this content and if you have any suggestions for future videos, or if you have any comments on this particular topic, I will gladly entertain them in the comment section. And I hope you enjoyed this content, and well, I will see you in the next video.